Wow. You guys have given us like a ton of material to go through this time.
Yeah.
The situation in the West Bank, it's pretty heavy stuff. We're talking tanks, we're talking mass displacement of people. It feels like that whole two-state solution thing is like hanging by a thread at this point.
Yeah, no kidding.
So, just to give everyone an idea of what we're dealing with here, we've got some seriously in-depth reporting from CNN, the BBC, the Times of Israel, even Al Jazeera.
Different perspectives, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's kind of what we're here for, right? To cut through all the noise and really get to the bottom of what's actually going on. Why does all this matter?
We got to connect the dots, figure out what's really driving this escalation. It's complex.
It's a lot to take in, even just reading the headlines. These articles are laying out some pretty alarming statistics and events.
Absolutely. We'll break down those numbers, tell the human stories behind them, and try to make sense of it all.
Okay, so for anyone out there who might not be totally up to speed on the region, let's start with the basics. What are we even talking about when we say West Bank?
Right. So the West Bank is this landlocked territory west of the Jordan River. It's been occupied by Israel since like 1967, and that's the core of the whole problem.
Right, over 3 million Palestinians live there.
Yeah, over 3.3 million, actually. But you've also got these Israeli settlements all over the place. These are communities that Jewish Israelis have built, but they're considered illegal under international law.
You've spent so much time on the region. Can you give us a sense of how this occupation actually impacts the lives of Palestinians there? And we can't forget about the refugee camps, right? Places like Jenin, which keep pop up in these articles.
Absolutely. Those camps, they were originally set up after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, but they've become, well, permanent homes for generations of displaced Palestinians. We're talking 70-plus years of disrupted lives.
Right. It's not just about the land, it's about the people. And speaking of international law, didn't the International Court of Justice issue some kind of ruling on all of this last year?
They did, yeah. The ICJ basically came out and said that Israel's occupation of the West Bank is illegal and has got to end. This ruling carries a lot of weight.
It threw gasoline on an already burning fire, you could say.
You could definitely say that.
So, with that history in mind, let's talk about the timeline here. Things have escalated pretty dramatically in recent months. It seems like the Hamas attack back in October 2023 was a major turning point, wouldn't you say?
It was a catalyst for sure, but tensions were already high before that. The Hamas attack, which came from Gaza, did trigger this wave of new Israeli restrictions, checkpoints, and, sadly, more settler attacks on Palestinians.
So it was like a powder keg waiting to explode.
Exactly. The attack was the spark.
And then we see these military operations that followed. Operation Summer Camps in August 2024, and then Operation Iron Wall starting in January 2025. The names themselves sound, well, pretty intense.
Yeah, even the language used is telling. Summer camps, Iron Wall, it's a sign of how aggressive the Israeli stance has become.
And it's not just talk. The articles describe tanks and armored vehicles rolling through Palestinian cities, essential services like water and electricity cut off, roads destroyed.
Right. And to try to understand this escalation, we need to look at what the Israeli government is saying. Israeli Defense Minister Katz has said that they are using the what he calls the Gaza playbook in the West Bank.
The Gaza playbook. Can you explain what he means by that?
Basically, it means going into Palestinian territory repeatedly to dismantle what Israel calls terror infrastructure. They're trying to target militant groups, but the way they're going about it is, well, causing a lot of collateral damage.
And that brings us to February 2025, where things took an even darker turn. The articles mentioned tanks being deployed in the West Bank, which hasn't happened in 20 years.
A major escalation for sure. It's a shift in strategy, and the impact on the Palestinian people has been devastating. We're talking over 40,000 Palestinians displaced from their homes just in the past few months.
Wow. 40,000 people. What does that actually look like on the ground? Paint us a picture.
Imagine entire families fleeing their homes, ending up in schools, mosques, makeshift camps. Not enough food, not enough water, not enough medical supplies. The Red Cross is extremely concerned.
The mayor of Jenin paints a particularly bleak picture in one of the articles.
Yeah. He describes homes and infrastructure destroyed, basic services disrupted, people living in constant fear. It's a humanitarian crisis unfolding.
And it goes beyond just the military, right? There are political motivations behind all of this.
Oh, absolutely. We'll get into those. But first, let's talk about the people and the ideologies shaping this conflict. The articles mention figures like Finance Minister Smotrich and his statements about, well, applying Israeli sovereignty over the entire West Bank.
And his comments about security being a war goal, it's chillin' stuff.
Yeah. It raises some serious questions about what the long-term objectives are here. Is this just about control, or is there a push for something more permanent, like annexation?
And what exactly does annexation mean in this context?
In this case, it means Israel formally declaring the West Bank as part of their territory, under their laws. The consequences for Palestinians would be huge, and it would throw any future peace negotiations into chaos.
So it seems like we're at a critical juncture here. Understanding the political backdrop is crucial. We'll dive into that right after a quick break.
So we're back, and digging into the political side of this conflict really adds another layer of complexity to what's happening in the West Bank.
It does.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to solve this puzzle, but half the pieces are missing, and the ones we do have are constantly changing shape. Yeah, great analogy, actually.
So right before the break, we were talking about the possibility of annexation. How much of a factor is that in this whole escalation?
Well, annexation has been like a big topic in Israeli politics for years. But it feels like it's gained some serious momentum recently, especially now that you have people like Smotrich in these key positions of power.
Right. It's like this dark cloud hanging over everything.
It is. It adds so much uncertainty to the whole situation.
And these articles keep pointing to the influence of Trump and how that shifted things for the Israeli right wing. Can you explain that a bit more?
Well, Trump's potential support for annexation has definitely emboldened the right wing in Israel. It's created this environment where these extreme positions they're becoming more mainstream.
So people like Smotrich are taking advantage of that shift.
Absolutely. They're pushing for policies that were like fringe ideas not that long ago.
And if annexation is actually on the table, what does that mean for the two-state solution, the one we've been hearing about for decades as the answer to peace in the region?
That's the big question. Some people are saying that this is it. The two-state solution is dead. It's not going to happen. And if Israel is moving towards annexation, the chances of a Palestinian state become even more remote.
So what are the alternatives then? The articles mention a one-state solution, but that seems, how could that even work?
It would be incredibly difficult, that's for sure. A single state where Israelis and Palestinians would have equal rights and representation. It sounds great in theory, but there are some massive obstacles to overcome.
Like what? What are the main hurdles there?
You've got these deep divisions and mistrust between the two sides. They disagree about everything: governance, security, even the identity of the state itself.
It's a fundamental clash.
And the biggest question is, are either side even willing to compromise enough to make it work?
The articles quote several Israeli and Palestinian officials. What are they saying about a one-state solution?
It's a mixed bag, really. Some Palestinian leaders see it as the only way to achieve true equality. Others are worried they'd end up marginalized in a state dominated by Israelis. On the Israeli side, some just reject it completely. They see it as a threat to their identity.
Right.
But then you've got a small but growing group who are open to the idea. They recognize that the current situation just isn't sustainable.
It doesn't feel like anyone's really ready to sit down and talk right now.
It's hard to imagine any kind of meaningful dialogue happening with all the tension and violence in the West Bank.
And in the meantime, you have real people caught in the middle of all of this.
Exactly. We can get lost in all this talk about settlements and annexation, but we can't forget about the human cost. 40,000 displaced Palestinians, families struggling to survive, kids growing up in this constant state of fear. These are the stories that need to be heard.
Yeah, those human stories get lost sometimes in all the political back and forth.
They do. But those are the stories we have to keep in mind.
Okay, before we move on, I want to touch on something else the articles bring up. They're not just focused on the West Bank. They also talk about how this escalation could affect the peace in Gaza.
Right. Even though the focus is on the West Bank right now, Hamas in Gaza is watching very closely. They see what's happening as a dangerous precedent, something that could easily spill over into their territory.
So there's a real fear that the West Bank could become this blueprint for renewed conflict in Gaza.
Absolutely. And if the ceasefire in Gaza breaks down, the entire region could be drawn into a much wider conflict. The consequences would be disastrous. There's a quote in one of the Al Jazeera pieces from a Hamas official. He says, and I'm quoting here, "Netanyahu is intentionally sabotaging the deal." He's talking about the ceasefire that's been in place since 2024.
They're saying that Netanyahu is intentionally escalating the situation.
That's how they see it. And it's a perspective we need to consider.
We've talked about the lack of political will to find a solution, but what about the international community? What can they do?
They definitely have a role to play. We've seen the ICJ ruling, the UN condemning the settlements. But the question is, are those statements enough?
Yeah, the occupation has been going well for decades. If the international community really wanted to stop it, wouldn't they have done it by now?
That's a valid point. There's a lot of talk, but not a lot of action.
So what can they actually do to make a difference?
Well, they can start by pushing for accountability. Hold those responsible for human rights violations accountable.
whether they're Israeli or Palestinian.
Exactly. And that means more than just statements. It means investigations, options, maybe even legal action. It's a tall order, but it's necessary.
What else?
Well, there's the economic angle. Many countries give aid to both Israel and Palestine. They can use that aid strategically, reward good behavior, and discourage actions that undermine peace.
So use their economic power to push for a peaceful resolution.
Right. And finally, there's diplomacy. The international community can help create opportunities for dialogue, mediation, even if it doesn't lead to immediate breakthroughs.
Just keep those lines of communication open.
Exactly. It's a small glimmer of hope in a pretty bleak situation.
Well, we've covered a lot. The history, the escalating violence, the politics, the human cost, the role of the international community. It's a lot to process. What's your biggest takeaway from all of this?
It's easy to feel pessimistic, like there's no hope. But I think the most important thing to remember is that conflict isn't inevitable. The decisions made in the coming weeks and months, by Israeli and Palestinian leaders, by the international community, those decisions will determine what happens next. We can't give up on the possibility of peace.
So what can our listeners do, sitting at home, maybe feeling overwhelmed by all this? How can they make a difference?
Don't turn away. Stay informed. Read articles from different perspectives. Listen to podcasts like this one. Get involved with organizations that are working on the ground. Educate yourself. Support humanitarian aid efforts.
Don't just be a bystander.
Right. And most importantly, remember the human beings at the heart of this. Their stories need to be heard, their voices amplified.
It's a reminder that even though this conflict feels far away, we can all play a role in working towards peace and justice.
Every voice matters. Every action, no matter how small, can contribute to building a better future for Israelis and Palestinians.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a tough conversation, but an important one. We hope this has encouraged you to learn more and engage with this critical issue.
So we're back, and before the break, you mentioned glimmers of hope. I got to be honest, after everything we've talked about, it's kind of hard to see those right now. Where do you see them in all this mess?
Well, remember we were talking about the one-state solution and how difficult that would be to pull off.
Yeah.
Well, these articles actually talk about some groups, both Israelis and Palestinians, who are already working together, like at a grassroots level, trying to make coexistence a reality.
So even with everything going on politically, there are people on the ground trying to build bridges. That's exactly it. They're talking to each other, tackling shared problems like resources and education, trying to build understanding between communities. It's like they're planting seeds for a different future.
That's good to hear. But it's got to be an uphill battle, right? Especially with people like Smotrich pushing for policies that just seem to divide people even more.
It is, but public opinion isn't like one big block. These articles also mention Israeli activists, human rights groups, even some politicians who are against the government's hardline approach. They're calling for restraint, for dialogue, for a different way to doing things.
So there are voices of dissent.
Yeah.
Even if they're not always the loudest. Do you see any signs that these voices are gaining any traction?
It's hard to tell for sure, but the fact that these articles are covering them, that their perspectives are out there, it suggests that maybe more people are starting to realize that there needs to be another way.
Okay. And what about the international community? I mean, they've made their statements, but is there anything they can actually do to support these peace efforts, like concrete steps?
Yeah, beyond just words, there are things they can do. We talked about using economic leverage, right? Rewarding positive actions, holding those responsible for human rights violations accountable. But they can also be more proactive in supporting these grassroots peace initiatives.
How so?
Money, resources, logistical support, that kind of thing. They can use their diplomatic channels to give a platform to those who are working for peace. They can help create spaces for dialogue, maybe even act as mediators, help bridge the gaps, build trust.
So it's like a carrot and stick approach.
Kind of, yeah. It's got to be a coordinated effort from within the region and from outside. And it means recognizing the agency of the people who are working for change on the ground.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm really struck by how complex this conflict is. All the history, the politics, the human cost, it's a lot. What's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
It'd be easy to just give in to pessimism, to feel like there's no hope. But I think the biggest takeaway here is that this conflict isn't inevitable. The choices that are made in the coming weeks and months by leaders on both sides, by the international community, those choices are going to shape the future. We can't lose sight of the fact that peace is still possible, even if it seems far away.
So what can our listener, sitting at home right now, maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by everything, what can they do to make a difference?
First, don't turn away. Keep learning. Read articles from lots of different sources. Listen to podcasts like this one. Get involved with organizations that are working on the ground. Learn about the conflict, about the different perspectives. Support humanitarian efforts. And this is important, don't forget about the people who are living this every day. Their stories need to be heard.
It's a call to action. Even though this feels like it's happening far away, we all have a part to play in pushing for peace.
We do. Every voice matters. Every action, even the small ones, they all add up. We can build a better future for everyone.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It was tough, but it was important to have this conversation. We hope you learned something new today, that you're inspired to learn more and to get involved.